maps, and meta-analysis. This is Folsom.
Facts.
And faces.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our ongoing coverage of the 2024 general election. I am fortunate today to be joined by my colleagues Alex and Monica. So I'll give them a brief chance to introduce themselves, and then we'll start talking about the state propositions on the ballot. So Alex, do you want to go first?
Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Anaya. I'm a finance budget analyst at the Department of Finance covering K-12 issues.
Hi, everyone. My name is Monica Davalos. I am a senior policy analyst at the California Budget and Policy Center, and I lead our work on housing and homelessness.
All right, thank you both. So I'll just really quickly give a high-level overview on the 10 different state propositions that voters will be deciding on this election. The first five that I'll mention in sequential order will be legislature-sponsored measures, and the other five are going to be voter-sponsored measures, so it's a pretty even mix. The first one is Proposition 2, which is a $10 billion bond to build schools and colleges throughout the state. Proposition 3 is an amendment to reaffirm the right of same-sex couples to marry. Proposition 4 is another $10 billion bond that responds to various aspects of climate change. Prop 5 is an amendment to lower voter approval requirements for local housing and infrastructure projects. Prop 6 is an amendment to prohibit the state from punishing inmates with involuntary work assignments. Then jumping over to Prop 32, an initiative to raise the state minimum wage. Prop 33 is an initiative to permit cities and counties to expand rent controls. Prop 34 is an initiative that requires certain providers to use 98% minimum of prescription drug revenues to direct patient care. Prop 35 is an initiative to make the MCO, Managed Care Organization, tax permanent. And then Prop 36 is an initiative to increase penalties for some crimes via a rollback of Proposition 47, which was passed back in 2014. So before we get into the deep dive on what each proposition does, do either of you have any insight on how a proposition can find its way to a voter ballot?
I can jump in here. Yeah. So there's two ways for a proposition to find its way on its ballot. First one being legislative measure, and the second one being a citizen or California resident initiative.
Awesome, thank you. Alex, since you volunteer for that one, and I know you work with finance in your day job, can you talk a little bit more about what a bond is? I feel like this is a concept that a lot of people may interpret as a tax, but there's a lot to it, and you could explain it a lot better than I could. So if you don't mind.
Yeah. So not all general obligation bonds are necessarily a tax increase. GO bonds are debt securities issued by the state to finance public infrastructure and other long-term capital projects like schools, transportation, climate, and parks. They are backed by the state's credit and taxing power, meaning that the state commits to using the tax revenue, which is known as general fund, to repay bondholders.
Got it. So functionally, what does that mean for like public financing? Like, so is the state's paying more debt, right? That's what it means.
Yeah, so the state will use its revenues, which it budgets annually. So the GO bonds are repaid over a fixed period, typically around 30 years. Annual payments on these bonds are part of the state's budget, and they must be carefully managed to avoid crowding out or spending on other priorities.
And then when the government is allowed to issue bonds, these are essentially a sale to the public to borrow from the public. And my understanding of a bond is basically, oh, you can just invest your money in it by purchasing a bond, and then you'll get payback from the state. Is that how all bonds work?
So there's two types of GO bonds that we typically see. There's the tax exempt bonds, which are interest is exempt from federal and sometimes state income taxes, attracting investors looking for tax advantage investments versus taxable bonds that the state may issue, which are generally used for projects that don't qualify for tax exempt status, like pension funding or private use of facilities.
Got it. Okay, thank you. That helps. Um, I think we can jump into each of the different bonds, or not bonds. Well, we will start with the bonds. Each of the different propositions now. Going down the list in the order that I introduced each of them, I'll give a little bit of polling at PPIC numbers from early in October for each of these, just to give a little additional context, but I'll largely leave the description to the two of you. So Prop 2, that $10 billion bond for building additional schools and colleges throughout the state. That polls at roughly 52% support, according to the PPIC. What does it do?
So for Prop 2, this is a proposition that provides 10 billion, which would be 8.5 for K-12 facilities, and then 1.5 would be for community colleges that would provide funding for school facilities, and then it would be repaid back over a 30-year period, but it would allow schools to get funding under the school facilities program, which allows for funding for new construction and modernization of school facilities, as well for infrastructure at the community college districts.
And then if this passes, would those funds be made available immediately?
These funds would be made available in incremental years. Roughly, the school facilities program does process and approve a set amount each year.
Got it. Monica, I don't know if you have anything to add on to that. Okay, we can move on to the next one. Proposition 3 is an amendment to reaffirm the right of same-sex couples to marry in the state. Do either of you have any additional insight on this one? Is there anything more to it than what the title makes it seem like? How deep does it go?
I think I'll just add that this is basically to provide the protection that we already have, not only at the state level, but at the federal level. There could be a change in presidential. We are coming to a November election where there could be a potential shift in power. So if that new administration chooses to take away that given right, then this amendment would pull back on the right to marriage, not only across the states, but here in California. So we're just trying to make that correction.
Got it. And I will note that this one polls at about 67% support. So definitely a majority of Californians feel that, at least according to the pollsters, this will be something that'll pass. The next one is Proposition 4, which is yet another bond. This one is also at $10 billion, and this is to respond to different aspects of climate change. I saw that there were different programs within this, and this one overall polls at 60% support. So notably, more support than the other bond that is on the ballot. I can also try to do a little bit more of a deeper explanation myself. So within this, there's much like Proposition 2, different subcategories of where the money would go. The biggest chunk would go to drinking water improvements throughout the state. That's about $2 billion worth of it, so a fifth of it. And then there's also, a prioritization within the bond of focusing on lower income communities and infrastructure needs therein. So you could argue that this is an equity-based bond. And some of the other things that it will do are it will also add protection funds for coastal lands, bays, and oceans, natural lands, and wildlife projects. Those are also at about $1.5 billion each. And then there's also additional funding in there for clean energy projects, which is almost $1 billion. And then finally, there's a small category of funds, about 300 million for agricultural projects. So very wide ranging, would affect different regions of the state, and definitely is something that has a lot of funds that have been raised for it on the for side, and not much for the against side, which may contribute to that support level that I was mentioning. Moving on to the next question, Proposition 5. This one will lower voter approval requirements for local housing and infrastructure projects, and has roughly 55% support of likely voters. Monica, I think you covered this one, so do you have thoughts on it?
Yeah, so for some additional detail, so it lowers the local vote requirement from a 2/3 vote, which is about 66% currently, to 55% for these local bonds, specifically for affordable housing and infrastructure projects, or public infrastructure projects. And the public infrastructure part can really encompass a wide variety of things, which is also really important to note, in addition to affordable housing. But it can include things like roads, schools, and wastewater facilities, just to name a few. But Prop 5 is on the ballot this time around because it is a legislatively placed constitutional amendment, because these local voting thresholds are enacted by the California Constitution. But I did want to highlight that bonds at the local level are very critical for affordable housing development. And as we all know, California has a shortage of housing, which is kind of one of the main reasons why we're seeing this on the ballot. The Legislative Analyst Office actually estimated that nearly an additional 20 to 50% of local bond measures would have passed under Proposition 5's lower voter requirement. So that's huge, right? So if this does pass, it could mean, a lot more money at the local level that can go to bonds. And there is precedence for this in California. It's not a totally new concept. We already do this for school bonds. So at the local level, school bonds only need a 55% vote, as opposed to every other type of bond typically needs that higher threshold. Um, and the one thing that's a little bit different than for local bonds than kind of general obligation bonds at the state level is that local bonds are typically repaid through property taxes, but there are limitations, and it's not to say like how much property taxes would increase. It's a scale and it depends. It doesn't mean that folks are going to see skyrocketing property taxes, which is definitely a fear, right? Cost of living is very high in California, but that's really not. I think that's more like fear a lot of the times when it comes to propositions and it comes to ballots specifically. But voters should just be kind of more wary of some of the fear mongering that is around there when it comes to local bonds. Um, and the one thing I did want to mention about bonds that I forgot earlier is that bonds for infrastructure are typically seen as a more equitable way to finance these longer living infrastructure projects that serve multiple generations. So they're paid over time, and just like taxpayers over time are paying it, um, and more folks benefit from it. It's not just one generation, and they really have lasting effects for our communities. So typically seen as a good way to fund longer term projects.
So, in other words, it's more equitable in the sense that they are more widely used for the general public in terms of infrastructure than other types of bonds. Is that what you were getting at?
Yeah, bonds for infrastructure. I mean, they just tend to serve more people over generations, right? And like
Yeah,
communities at large also tend to reap those benefits. It's not just concentrated for a small amount of people.
gotcha. Okay, thank you. Proposition 6 is an amendment to prohibit the state from punishing inmates with involuntary work assignments. This one only polls at roughly 41% support, so this is the first one that we've got to that has a majority of voters, or at least a plurality of voters that are planning to vote against it at this point. Um, do either of you have anything to say about this one? Okay, I know from what I've been hearing about it that it's been one that's billed as I believe I'm using a quote, the last vestige of slavery. One of the federal constitutional amendments, famously banned slavery, and within that there is a clause that is, well, with the exception of people who are being punished for a crime. So you can argue that that has been part of the design of the initial amendment at the federal level, and there have been campaigns throughout the decades to try to get rid of that wherever it may be. And to the extent that the people who are in favor of that have been successful, I mean, they were able to get it to the ballot through their legislature, but polling at that 41% support, curious to see if it does manage to pass this election. Moving on to Proposition 32. This is an initiative to raise the state minimum wage. And this one is pretty evenly split in the polling. It is at 50% support right now. So this one really could go either way depending on how the turnout is on this election. Um, Monica, is this one of the ones that you have experience with covering?
Yeah. Just to dive a little bit deeper. So Prop 32, interestingly, really modestly raises the state's minimum wage in 2025 and 2026. So for example, under Prop 32, employers with 26 employees or more, they would have to increase their minimum wage to $17 an hour and then to 18 in 2025. And for those with 25 or fewer employees, it would have to increase to $17 in January 2025 and then to 18 in 2026. So a small difference there. The thing is that California's minimum wage is currently $16 an hour. So Prop 32 isn't really that big of a jump from where we're currently at and where we're actually kind of going toward as California's minimum wage also continues to go up. And so on the whole, though, it would only increase our current minimum wage by $2 an hour over a 2 to 3 year period, depending on the size of the business. And so this new minimum wage would actually be roughly $1 higher than it otherwise would have been under current law. And so the interesting thing too about Proposition 32 is that it's estimated only about 10% of California workers actually made less than $16 or in 2023. And suggesting that really a small share of workers would actually benefit from Prop 32's modest wage boost. And this is because of three main reasons. The first being that a lot of Californians work in jurisdictions that have higher minimum wage laws than the statewide minimum wage. And so they wouldn't be covered by Proposition 32. And this covers folks that live in some of the largest cities in California. It includes LA, San Jose, San Diego, and San Francisco. The other piece is that roughly over 500,000 fast food restaurant employees are now required to be paid at least $20 an hour beginning earlier this year. That went into effect. And the last component is that almost another 500,000 healthcare workers have to be paid significantly above minimum wage. It was supposed to begin between October 2024 to January 2025 is when that additional wage boost is supposed to kick in. So that's why this is really going to cover a very small percentage of Californians. Granted, we know that the cost of living in California is higher than our minimum wage. So really any modest wage boost is needed, but on the whole, though, like Prop 32 really doesn't go that far beyond where we're currently at. I also wanted to highlight quickly what the research does show us about minimum wage increases is that modest wage increases aren't actually really tied to detectable job losses. And if there are price increases that follow minimum wage increases or minimum wage hikes, they tend to be very small and really unlikely to affect people's purchasing decisions.
I'm glad you added that portion at the end because I feel like the two things that I always hear about people who tend to be against minimum wage raises are job losses and then cost of living. So to the extent that you already touched on the former, on the latter, um, especially since you mentioned that this is a potentially modest raise, do you expect that it would have a significant effect on prices?
Honestly, no, because it's such a modest increase and kind of folks who employers already knew that California's minimum wage is going to be increasing anyways. So assuming they would have been factoring in for that already. And Prop 32 is really just kind of a slight addition to that if it does come to fruition, if it does pass. And from what the research shows us, like it really doesn't lead to those price hikes.
Gotcha. Thank you. Proposition 33 is an initiative that will permit cities and counties to expand their rent controls. This is also not a super popular one. It only has 42% support among slightly voters right now. Rent control related propositions aren't something that's new to California. Monica, is this one that you would like to talk about as well? Um, yeah.
Yeah, I'm on a roll. But yeah, so Proposition 33 repeals what's known as the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act of 1995. And so this law restricts the ways local governments can actually impose local rent control policies and generally prevents the state from limiting localities from enacting or expanding residential rent control. And so what Proposition 33 is saying is like, let's get rid of this law completely. And so it essentially is just giving localities the opportunity to potentially expand rent control within their jurisdictions. However, that is not a guarantee. Localities would still have to go and like actually pass these laws at the local level in their jurisdictions. And I do want to note, though, that thoughtfully designed rent stabilization laws can really be vital in protecting tenants from rent hikes that really outpace their incomes and ensure housing stability. We saw rents dramatically increase over the pandemic, right? Housing is really just one of the main really crises that's facing Californians today. Um, However, I do want to note that by proposing a complete repeal of Prop 33, I'm sorry, a complete repeal of Costa-Hawkins, Prop 33 doesn't necessarily account for some of the complexities that can come with rent control and how they may be designed in different communities. So that's kind of one of the fears of completely repealing it without ensuring additional safeguards that would ensure that housing continues to get built in developments, because sometimes very strict rent control laws means that the return of investment isn't there for housing developers. And some communities want that. Some communities can design rent control in ways that disincentivize construction in their neighborhoods, which is a negative thing when we need housing at all levels in California. Um, and I also wanted to note that the research does show from rent control laws, if they're not thoughtfully designed, there can be some negative effects on renters and property owners if it's not really paired with policies that protect renters intentionally and promote housing development. And I wanted to use, for example, that California does currently have like a statewide rent cap. This isn't necessarily new. Um, but for example, the California Tenant Protection Act of 2019 imposed rent increase limits for most housing types statewide, while requiring just cause evictions and an exemption for housing developments built within the last 15 years. And these were two kind of safeguards that were really intentional to ensure that tenants had some type of protection so they couldn't just be, kicked out of their um, homes for, whatever reason their landlord wanted to give them. But it also included the exemption for housing developments for within 15 years to ensure that return on investment, especially for affordable housing developments, which it's just extremely difficult to build in California and even more difficult for products to pencil out as is. Um, and so that's sorry, that's probably more information, but I just want to note though, what Prop 33 does, it's really just setting the stage for localities to potentially do something, but it doesn't actually mean stronger rent control policies will be passed at the end of the day.
I don't really have a whole lot of historical knowledge on this, but you did mention at the top that your expertise is with regards to housing. Um, Historically, when there's been these sorts of initiatives on the ballot, or even if it's been passed locally or some sort of push, how likely are cities to take advantage of ability to impose rent controls?
I would say it depends on the city.
Hmm.
The thing is, current like cities right now can pass rent control laws. It's not that they can't, but there's certain
Hmm.
restrictions under Costa-Hawkins that they have to abide by. And granted, that means after a certain time period and certain types of housing types, they can't impose rent control. But
Hmm.
before a certain period and certain housing types, they can. So if there are localities that were serious about passing rent control in whatever form they possibly could, they could have done that by now if they had the voter support behind that and really kind of the local government leadership to do that. That is a possibility. But if that hasn't happened now, maybe, it could be for a variety of reasons. Um, but that option has been there, but some folks just simply haven't implemented it for whatever reason in their communities.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you. I think that's a lot of info for this one, so we can move on to the next one. Um, Proposition 34 is an initiative that will require certain healthcare providers to use at least 98% of prescription drug revenues to direct patient care. Now, this one, just as a voter who doesn't have a lot of expertise in the medical area, I was kind of confused about at the beginning. So I had to do a lot of research on it. Before I talk about it a little bit, do either of you have anything you want to say about this one? No? Okay. Um, this one is interesting. As far as it seems like analysts can tell, um, from what's publicly available, it really only is going to affect one organization, and that is the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. And in particular, it seems like the motivation has been that this organization is really active when it comes to funding different ballot measures. I believe they were a part of funding for Proposition 33 on this same ballot. Um, And this proposition is sponsored by different trade groups for California's landlords in the state. So to the extent that a 98% revenue minimum going towards direct patient care, it seems pretty squarely aimed at making it so that this organization is no longer going to be able to continue funding future ballot measures. So from that angle, this definitely seems like a very politically motivated proposition, more so than, political propositions are. Um, Moving on to 35, Proposition 35 is an initiative to make the MCO, Managed Care Organization tax permanent in the state. This one's a bit more popular than some of the ones we've just been talking about. It polls at roughly 62% support among likely voters. And before I turn it over to either of you, um, I'll just mention that a managed care organization is a healthcare company or health plan that manages and coordinates healthcare services for its members. Typically, they do this in a way to control costs while trying to maintain or improve care quality. Um, do either of you have anything you want to say about this one?
I can. I will say too, the interesting thing about the MCO tax is that MCO, so the managed care organizations, actually are generally a fan of this tax because they aren't charged very much for patients with private health insurance. And generally, when they receive Medi-Cal payments, so when they get paid back for the services, from they get paid back from state and federal funds that actually offset the portion of the tax that they pay. So they essentially just get the money back. So it's like a tricky finance maneuver type of thing. It's very wonky. Um, but for some, I do want to say we're seeing Prop 35 on the ballot. One of the main reasons is because of the state budget shortfall that we had this year, and resistance from state leaders to really raise additional revenues. The MCO tax was really seen as one of the main ways of how we closed this year's state budget deficit. And so, unfortunately, that meant that a lot of folks in the healthcare industry were very upset that these funds were used to kind of offset the deficit instead of going back into the Medi-Cal system to help with repayment and reimbursement costs. So that's pretty much the precipice for Prop 35. And what Prop 35 is really doing is two main things. One, it would require the state to request federal approval for the ongoing MCO tax on an ongoing basis. And two, allocate these funds for certain healthcare investments. So it would take away the power of the state to use these funds in other ways to, for example, close a future deficit that would no longer be allowed if Proposition 35 passes. And I can say some other notes, but I wanted to see if Alex also wanted to chime in. No.
Oh, good. I think it's just mainly highly dictating the complex spending plan that already is in place. I think just choosing new winners and losers of who benefits in the healthcare system rather than prioritizing the needs of patients. So I think kind of how you mentioned the budget shortfall, the MCO covered most of it. So I think they're just making sure that it's approved by the federal government rather than just using it for a shortfall.
Well, Monica, to the extent that this, if it passes, which, polling indicates it might, um, not being able to use it to cover a future shortfall, is that limiting the state's options? And also, somewhat unrelatedly, uh, I don't know a whole lot about healthcare, but isn't there a complex interaction amongst the state healthcare program and the federal funding? So to what extent does that interfere with that system?
I think to your first very great question as that yes, it does limit how we can it does tie the hands of the state. Like if we do, in the future face some type of deficit, it means that state leaders are going to have to make real decisions between like cutting even like healthcare services or cutting other public infrastructure service or cutting funding for affordable housing, um, or just other parts in our critical budget that really fund a lot of these essential public services. And while we did see cuts this year and very drastic ones in certain areas, in general, like it was kept somewhat whole, but without these funds, it could really mean very, very tough decisions for the services that Californians are using. Millions of Californians benefit from, if not all of us in some way. Um, and then for the second part, the interaction between like how federal funding and reimbursement, I will say that's a little bit outside of my scope, but I do know that in general, one thing I'll note is that the federal government has to agree to this tax in the first place, right? So if we look forward to a different administration or one that's maybe less amicable to certain states, that could put this in jeopardy as well. And like what would happen then is really kind of a big question. And there are certain, I believe, measures in Prop 35 that kind of account for this, but it could at the end of the day mean these funds don't actually reach where they're supposed to go, or there's not as much of these funds that were anticipated in the first place. If that kind of answers your question.
It does. Thank you. Just really quickly, you said regularly approved by the federal government. Is that on an annual basis?
I believe so, but I would have to double check.
Okay, no worries. Appreciate all the discussion on that one. Our last proposition that we're going to cover today is Proposition 36. This is an initiative that would increase penalties for some crimes through a rollback of Proposition 47. Again, was passed in 2014. This one is the most popular on the ballot according to polling at 73% support. And just anecdotally as a voter, I know I've heard the most noise about this one. So do either of you have anything you would like to add about this?
It's me again. Yeah, so I will say, so Prop 36 is frustrating as from my personal standpoint. I will say, like, our organization, we don't take stances on ballot propositions, but we do have a lean, in all transparency, a lean against Proposition 36 because of various reasons, really the deep equity reasons, but also the impacts on the California state budget if Prop 36 does pass, and the implications there. But Proposition 36 would increase penalties for several drug and theft crimes, in part by reversing key portions of Prop 47, which was passed back in 2014. And it generally or broadly, for example, it would allow for a felony to be charged for drug possession in certain circumstances, which is actually a reclassification, as most unlawful drug possessions are considered misdemeanors. But I'm sorry, let me back up a bit if I can explain a little bit of Prop 47, just a quick refresher. So Prop 47 was passed by about 60% by California voters, approved to pass Prop 47 back in 2014. And this was a major criminal justice reform in California. And because of it, we actually saw our prison population decline because our prisons were very overcrowded and a lot of folks were being diverted to prisons and potentially in scenarios that there were alternatives. And so Prop 46 reclassified 6 nonviolent drug and property crimes from felonies to misdemeanors, really shifting the sentencing from state prisons to county jails or probation. So it's not like folks were still paying for their crimes and mistakes. It just necessarily wasn't in state prisons anymore or as high of rates. And because of this, it significantly reduced state prison costs by hundreds of millions of dollars over the last decade. And the other key component of Prop 47 is that it actually required the savings that we got from prison savings, which has been about $800 million over the last decade, to be reinvested for behavioral health treatment and other critical services that really promote community safety and have reduced recidivism. So it's been a really great way to spend the savings that we have received from from reducing our prison population. However, Prop 36 now is really on the ballot. After the pandemic, we did see, or really the perception of certain crimes increasing. So folks have really taken a closer look at Prop 47 and have really tried placing blame on that. But I do want to clarify that Prop 47 isn't actually linked to organized retail theft or shoplifting, as it's being pointed to in some of the campaigns. and really organized retail stuff that we have kind of seen on the rise rose to predominance following the isolation and the social breakdown caused by the pandemic. And this was long after voters approved Prop 47. Um, there's various reasons why kind of crime increases, but at the same time, like like folks who are trying to draw the link between Prop 36 and Prop 47, it's it's not there. And there's a lot of narratives around it. And generally, what we do advise is for voters to just be very cautious of measures that try to roll back criminal justice reforms. Um, and sorry, I've got on my soapbox a little bit, but on the implications of the state budget, because more folks could potentially be diverted to state prisons, this means that our costs would go up again. And so, how we fund our state prisons is through our state budget. So that means policymakers, again, are going to have to make the decision. It's like, where do we potentially cut or reshift funds from to now fund more money into our correctional system because more folks are there? And that means more trade offs. It also means that the savings right now that are being used for these awesome programs that are providing behavioral health treatment, um, um, education, and housing for certain folks, those savings would be gone. So those programs would also be defunded in turn. And so on the whole, though, we do just lead with caution in general because of really some of the negative implications that can come from Prop 36.
So to get a sense of the scale here of how this could really affect California, I know there's been a trend in the state, both as a cost saving measure and just generally with criminal justice reform, of the California Department of Correctional CDCR was the Corrections and Rehabilitation. There we go. um, there's been a trend of closing state prison facilities. For example, in 2022, CDCR announced the planned closure of Chuckawalla Valley State Prison by 2025. With that being a possible example where we're still in the middle of the time frame where they're implementing it, um, if this proposition does pass, which again, it is the most likely to pass based on the polling, does it threaten to reverse that trend and therefore put additional pressure on the state budget?
Yes, and potentially could reverse the trend of us closing more prisons. And right, there has been other reports that shown that California can actually close more prisons that would we already have closed, right? And those would result in even more savings to our state budget that can be invested in our healthcare and affordable housing and childcare and other critical things. Um, but the thing is, the magnitude of how many Californians this would affect is also kind of up in the air. Like there's various estimates of how much this could potentially cost the state, from like tens of millions to potentially billions of dollars, if Prop 36 does pass. So it would not only reverse that, but potentially cost us more than what we've been able to save. So.
Then I would guess maybe a slight follow-up on that for Alex. At a high level, we talked about different bond measures. We talked about how some of the nuances of these propositions could, if they pass, impose additional restrictions on the state. Um, what's the potential danger? Maybe danger is not the right word, but what's the potential risks for the state or restrictions if every bond measure pass, and every proposition that could either dictate that the state spend its money in a certain way or not spend its money a certain way. Like what's the scale here of how the state could be restricted? Is it a trend that has already been moving in that direction and therefore wouldn't really be a huge change? Or, in your opinion, do you think that this is something that, um, it differs from previous elections?
I think there can be a change coming forward, given that it seems like some of these propositions are not only trying to restrict the state in some areas, but also with the bonds, the state is also already fiscally planning for some bonds on the other hand. So, like with the MTO tax, it looks like the state would have to go to get federal approval for the way it spends, being a little bit more transparent versus when you have some new initiatives like the Prop 2 for state school facilities where the state's already planning for debt service in a 30-year fiscal plan. So I think the trend can be a little bit more restrictive outwards.
Okay. And then, I know one thing that we hear about too, and especially during this last budget cycle, we heard about that the state is in despite the budget deficit that was closed, still a fairly strong fiscal position. Um, you know, to do you does it seem like the state being in a strong fiscal position um, gives it more ability to adapt to these sort of changes?
I think I'll add from a Californian that even though there's articles and there's polling that the state is creating more jobs, that inflation may be going down, we see that there's an increase for or a proposition for increase in minimum wage. I think that Californians as a whole and maybe Americans are still feeling that prices are still high compared to what it was before COVID. So I think we're just thinking that most of these propositions, like the minimum wage, might not be most impactful to Californians unless there's a higher percentage of an increase.
Gotcha. Okay, well, thank you both. I feel like we talked a lot about these. Do you have any closing thoughts? Anything you want to plug? I just for my own part, I'll say the more that people can turn out to vote, the better. It's a some view it as a civic duty, others view it as just as an important part of, having your voice heard, and especially in your local and state races. Even if you feel like your vote's not going to matter in terms of like the presidential election, it definitely does, especially with some of the margins that I mentioned here. Like for example, the 50-50 support on Proposition 32, every vote counts on that one. So please anyone that may be listening to this, we encourage you to vote this election.
I'll echo the same comments too, and I think specifically this upcoming ballot election, there's a lot of ranges between schools, facilities, housing, criminal justice reform, climate change. So just being informed, voting, but also making a rightful choice would be something that's very important in this upcoming election.
Yeah, I agree. And I will just add, I feel like this ballot is really a reminder to us all that one, your vote does matter, like you all both said, and voting is a privilege, and very much your vote really does determine what California's values and priorities are. And as you can tell from the 10 propositions, those really display it clearly. So I just encourage folks to also do a little bit of research in seeing who's funding which campaigns, as that in itself can provide a different perspective with the more information that you have.
All right. Well, thank you, Alex. Thank you, Monica. Catch you all next time.